The classic zombie, slow, deliberate, and somehow still one of the most effective threats ever designed for a game. This type traces directly back to George Romero's cinematic vision from the late 1960s, and when developers first brought it into interactive media, it fit immediately. The rules were simple from day one. It doesn't sprint, it doesn't plan, it just moves forward with total indifference. And that single behavioral trait became the foundation of an entire genre. One classic zombie on screen barely registers as a problem. Add 50 and the entire calculation changes. What made this archetype endure wasn't individual danger, it was the math of inevitability. A threat that multiplies and never retreats and never gets tired taught players an entirely new way to think about resource management and survival. The runner. Speed changed everything. The runner zombie introduced a completely different emotional register to the genre, less creeping dread, more immediate urgency. Where the classic zombie gave players time to think, the runner removed that luxury almost entirely. This shift happened across both film and games simultaneously in the early 2000s, and the effect on design philosophy was significant. Suddenly, positioning mattered in a different way. Reaction time became a core skill. The runner didn't just add speed to an existing formula, it asked players to engage with zombie encounters as reflex challenges rather than strategic puzzles. Both approaches have their devoted audiences, and the runner created a lane for high-intensity zombie gameplay that had never existed before. The bloater. Distance becomes the most important resource when the bloater is in the room. This type arrived as designers started exploring what extended transformation might look like, a body that keeps changing long past basic functionality, becoming dangerous in a completely different way than mobility or aggression. The bloater punishes close-range combat instincts, rewarding patience and positioning over aggression. It introduced a reading challenge, too. Players needed to identify and respond to this threat differently than anything else in the encounter, which added a layer of visual literacy to zombie combat. The design communicated danger through appearance alone, making it one of the cleaner examples of form and function aligning perfectly in enemy design. The spitter. Ranged capability in an undead enemy fundamentally changes how players interact with their environment. The spitter removed the safety of distance that most zombie encounters quietly offered, forcing constant repositioning and eliminating the comfort of elevated or protected positions. Left 4 Dead's version of this archetype became the benchmark, and its influence spread across cooperative zombie games for years afterward. What made the spitter so effective as a design element was how little complexity it actually required. One new attack vector, and the entire mental model of level navigation had to be reconsidered. Players who thought they understood a space found that understanding immediately outdated the moment a spitter appeared. The tank. Some encounters exist to test everything at once. The tank zombie represents a specific design intention, introducing a threat so far above the standard difficulty curve that it forces players to spend resources they were saving, coordinate in ways they hadn't needed to be before, and make fast decisions under compounding pressure. What separates the tank from a standard boss encounter is context. It arrives mid-level, without preparation time, often surrounded by other active threats. The challenge isn't just the tank itself, it's managing the tank while everything else continues. Left 4 Dead's version became the definitive template, but the concept predates it and has continued evolving in games since. The Witch. Avoidance as a skill. The Witch introduced something genuinely uncommon in action-oriented game design, a high-threat enemy that players were rewarded for not engaging. Loud, aggressive behavior triggered it. Careful, quiet movement allowed safe passage. That behavioral design asked players to completely shift their approach mid-session, moving from combat mentality into deliberate restraint while everything else around them continued demanding attention. The psychological weight of moving quietly past a hyper-aware threat is a specific kind of tension that direct combat encounters can't replicate. The Witch became memorable not because of the moment it activated, but because of the mental pressure it created in every moment before that. The Crawler. Changing the vertical axis of a threat changes everything about how players process it. The Crawler zombie exploited the floor-level blind spot that most players instinctively leave open during fast-paced combat, moving through debris and clutter in ways that upright enemies simply couldn't. In chaotic encounters with multiple threats, a Crawler became genuinely difficult to track in peripheral vision, not because of special abilities, but because it occupied a part of the visual field that players weren't actively monitoring. The design insight was minimal and effective. Anatomy was the mechanic. No additional systems required. The Screamer. Not every threat fights directly. The Screamer archetype built its entire danger profile around amplification. an enemy whose primary function was making the situation worse for everyone within range by drawing additional threats into the encounter. Players learned quickly to prioritize screamers regardless of the immediate physical danger they posed, because the cost of ignoring one outweighed almost any other tactical consideration. That prioritization created real-time triage decisions that most pure combat encounters never generate. Do you address the immediate physical threat, or break off to neutralize the one enemy that could escalate the entire situation? The Screamer introduced that question into zombie gameplay, and it changed how players approached map awareness entirely. The Infected. Inception, instead of the supernatural. The Infected archetype marked a meaningful philosophical shift, moving the zombie concept away from resurrection mythology and toward viral or parasitic transformation. Films and games explored this simultaneously in the early 2000s, and the mechanical implications were significant. Infected moved faster, responded to stimuli more realistically, and felt more immediately plausible than classical undead. The horror became grounded in something that required no suspension of disbelief, just a credible enough pathogen. For players who had grown up with supernatural zombie aesthetics, the Infected hit differently, not because it was more dangerous on paper, but because the explanation felt uncomfortably possible. The Parasite Host. Two threats nested inside one encounter. The Parasite Host zombie introduced a second stage to the standard combat loop, fundamentally changing what it meant to defeat an enemy. Resident Evil 4 built entire combat systems around this concept: eliminate the host, then deal with what emerged from it. That second stage often had different vulnerabilities, different movement patterns, and required different tools than the outer threat. The design forced players to carry diverse loadouts and think ahead about resource allocation in ways that single-stage enemies never demanded. It also carried distinct thematic weight, drawing from body horror traditions to suggest that the creature visible on the surface wasn't the actual threat driving the encounter. The Armored Zombie. The most reliable tool in zombie combat, the targeted weak point, stops working when the weak point is protected. Armored zombies challenge the foundational assumption that a specific approach would always solve the problem, pushing players toward alternative strategies like flanking, environmental hazards, or targeting unprotected areas. The design also communicated world-building information efficiently. Equipment carried before transformation, improvised protection accumulated afterward, or biological adaptation developed through mutation, each version told a story about the world and its timeline without requiring exposition. The Armored Zombie made defeating an enemy feel like solving a problem with context rather than executing a memorized solution. The Child Zombie. Rarely used and always intentional. When designers include this type, they're making a deliberate statement about the world they've constructed and the emotional stakes they want players to carry. The discomfort is the design. Mechanically, smaller enemies often move unpredictably, access spaces larger threats cannot, and create hesitation through recognition rather than capability. But the real function is emotional framing, establishing that the game's world has reached a particular kind of severity. Titles that deploy this type carefully use it as a narrative signal as much as a gameplay element, and the most effective implementations understand the difference between using discomfort purposefully and using it carelessly. The Volatile. The world itself becomes the resource. The Volatile inverted standard horror game logic by making light, specifically UV sources, the primary counter to the most dangerous enemy in the roster. Dying Light committed fully to this concept through a day-night cycle that genuinely changed how the game felt to play. Daytime offered familiar, manageable challenge. Nighttime introduced volatiles, faster, more aggressive, and responsive to player presence in ways that daytime enemies were not. What made the system work was authenticity. The threat had to be real enough that players actually restructured their behavior around the time of day, planning routes and objectives accordingly, rather than simply noting the mechanic and ignoring it. The Exploder. Closing distance is the attack. The Exploder transformed the act of an enemy approaching into the primary threat itself, demanding constant spatial awareness and backward movement management as core survival skills. Stopping the charge required resources. Being too close when the charge ended required positioning. Both demands existed simultaneously during every encounter, creating a specific kind of pressure that static or melee-only enemies couldn't generate. The Exploder also introduced countdown tension into firefights, not a timer on screen, but a physical urgency communicated through an enemy closing distance faster than comfort allowed. That visceral reading of threat made it one of the more instinctively understood zombie types across different player experience levels. The Zombie Horde.
Individual encounters stop mattering when the Horde arrives. This isn't a single enemy type, it's a design philosophy built around the idea that overwhelming numbers create a fundamentally different kind of challenge than any single powerful enemy could. The Horde demanded area control thinking, choke point strategy, and a willingness to accept that some threats would never be individually addressed. World War Z is a game committed fully to this concept, building visual and mechanical systems around managing massive quantities of movement rather than targeting specific enemies. The result transformed zombie gameplay from a series of discrete encounters into something closer to environmental management. And for players who connected with that approach, it produced some of the most distinctive and replayable experiences the entire genre has ever delivered.